Okay, so no matter where or what kind of project you try to accomplish, there's always one thing that's needed, and that, of course, is money. And now, in our next panel, we'll be looking at how climate projects can attract financing. Please give a warm welcome to our next expert and moderator, Ms. Barbara Buchner, Executive Director of the Climate Policy Initiative. Hello.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you can hear me. Yes, my name is Barbara Buckner, and it's a true pleasure for me being back here in Austria as an Austrian who actually grew up in a small village close to Graz and now lives in California. You might see some parallels here, but unfortunately that's the only ones. Anyway, I'm really, truly honored to be back, and I do want to thank the organizers for having me here and giving me a chance to being part of the 4th Austrian World Summit. It's also a true privilege for me to be the moderator of the distinguished panel that we're going to listen to now. And this panel is going to explore ways of accelerating investment in climate projects. And this, in turn, is a key enabler for reaching one of the specific goals of the Paris Agreements, which is making climate finance flows consistent with the low emissions and climate resilient pathways towards sustainable development. And so with that, let me invite my panelists to come on stage before I'm going to set the scene and then start a panel discussion here. So first, let me invite Mahama Kapia, who is the Executive Director of ECOWAS Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, ICRI, on the floor. And next, let me invite Terry Tamminen, who is the CEO of the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation, to join us here. Thank you. And next, it's my pleasure to invite Christian Schön, who is the a member of the executive board of the Erste Asset Management, to join you as well. Next, let me invite Patrick Schörle, who is the CEO of Blue Orchard, to join us. Patrick. Next, it's my pleasure to invite Renat Herberger, who is the CEO of South Pole Group, to join us. Thank you. And last but certainly not least, let me invite Martin Hiller, who is the Executive Director of REAP, to join us here. Okay, wonderful. So let me just start by quickly setting the scene before I'm going to start our first round of discussion here on the panel. And I think what I want to start with is that finance is arguably the key challenge in transitioning towards a low-carbon, climate-resilient future. CPI's Global Landscape of Climate Finance shows that $392 billion are invested globally in 2014, and that is an increase of 15% compared to the year before. And it's largely due to an constant increase in public investment, but it's also really true that it's been a record investment by the private sector. And that in turn has been driven also by the technology costs, which have been falling sharply over the last decades. So while the good news is that more money than ever is being invested at the moment, we all know that it's falling far short of the needs that we have in order to get us on a low-carbon, climate-resilient pathway. And just to put out one of the estimates out there, the International Energy Agency estimates that you need about $16.5 trillion within the next 15 years to just get the energy sector on track for a sustainable future. So we do need trillions and not the billions. My organization, CPI's mission is to drive economic growth while addressing climate change, focusing on policy and finance. And we really work to understand investment trends. We work to accelerate the effective use of public and private resources. And we work to really try to develop and scale transformative financial solutions. And let me just put out our 3 key lessons that we've learned in the last 7 years before I'm going to throw all the difficult questions to you and hope that you will help us answer the open questions that we have. The first lesson, policy matters, and I think we've heard a lot about that today. Our work shows that the majority of climate investment is raised and spent in the same country. And that means about 74% of climate finance flows never cross the border. And this share increases to more than 90% if you look at private investment only. And so because domestic investment dominates, it is really fundamental that you get domestic policy frameworks and the public support systems right. The second is knowledge is power. I think we've seen over the last year that there's been a lot of increasing knowledge on what are risks related to climate change for investors. But at the same time, what we also see is that there still is a need to increase awareness about the risks, but also the opportunities for investors. And therefore, you need to enhance the integration of environmental, of social, and of governance factors into the daily decision-making in the finance sector. And so I really hope that we can hear a little bit about this role as well. And finally, we need to think out of the box. I think we've heard some of the examples already in the previous panels. I think if you really want to reach the scale that is needed to fill the investment gap, then you need to address the real and the perceived risks that still keep investment from flowing into climate action. And you need to really do that by develop and innovate, to refine and come up with transformable, actionable solutions that can really help to get investment to scale and do that globally. So this is kind of setting the scene a little bit. We are going to look into all these issues at this panel here, so stick with us. And I'm really excited to start the first round, which will mostly focus around the first two areas, really understanding what are some of the incentives, the success factors that are needed in order to enable investors to go into the area of climate action. And so with that, let me immediately start with Mr. Kapia. We already have heard about ICRI before from your colleague on the previous panel, but I think what I'd like to hear a little bit more, I mean, you really are helping to provide access to reliable, to clean, to affordable energy in West Africa. What are some of the success factors that you've seen that can make this happen on a larger scale?
Yes. Thank you very much. Let me just start by saying that actually Paris was one unique opportunity that, humankind ever had. But this was for the first time that all countries, almost all countries, came together to say, yes, let's keep the temperature rise not above 2 degrees Celsius, and let's make effort to limit it to 1.5. That's really a lot. And what does this mean? It means that we should redirect finance flows to low carbon, climate resilient investments. That is, and I think that is the right way to go. The right way to go is, let me just say that climate investment are actually financially viable. It's just that we are used to some old ways of doing things that we just scared to change. But when you change, you see that really happening. Experts estimate that $90 trillion, like I said, is required for infrastructure, agriculture, and energy for us to accomplish the Paris Agreement. And I know climate change finance has been making a lot of efforts, and you just mentioned $392 billion in 2014, and efforts have been made to actually, I say, draw in about 100 billion a year to the Green Climate Fund. That's from 2020. But just as you said, this is still not enough. There's no amount of addition you make to get 90 trillion by 2030, which tells you that we have a long way to go. That's where you just said, thinking out of the box. So it means that all hands have to be on deck, both private and public sector, government and non-government, developing countries and developed countries, state and non-state actors all have to come on board. From our side, as a regional economic community, what we did was to mobilize our member states on the policy front to get the right policy and the enabling regulatory environment that will attract investment to climate resilient projects in our region. And we did that by adopting, you heard the commissioner said, we adopted 2 policies, which were the regional policy for renewable energy and the regional policy for energy efficiency. These 2 policies set concrete targets for both renewables and energy efficiency for the entire region. That's the entire ECOWAS region of about 300 million people. That was one figure. I don't want to bother you too much with figures, but at least it's good to mention the population. Over 300 million people, where we have about 170 of that population not having access to electricity. So we should not use the long way that others used to get us this far. We should leapfrog to ensure that we also have access to clean, affordable, energy sources to carry out economic activities without polluting, our environment as has been done in the past. And interestingly, these policies were translated by all the 15 member states into national action plans for renewable energy and energy efficiency, and further translated into NDCs for all ECOWAS countries. So at the point when they said people should come up with nationally determined contributions, we already had action plans that we could convert to our nationally determined contribution. And every ECOWAS member state has done that. So, ECRI as we are, we form as a platform to share knowledge, share experiences, and give policy guidance to our member states to ensure that we embark on policies that will encourage green investment and green development. And like I said, all these projects which have been identified in the NDCs, part of our obligation is to see how can we mobilize the financing. You'll be surprised. Here today, at the end of this forum, we will be signing an agreement of 10 gigawatts. And that will be the largest that we will ever sign with R20 to develop green projects of up to 10 gigawatts to support the green development of the ECOWAS region. Let me stop here and we'll go ahead.
Right. Well, thank you so much, and certainly I think that the core, importance of policy is clearly, of leapfrogging. I think it's key here, and certainly congratulations on the agreement that you're going to sign. But I think this is a very nice kind of transfer to our next speaker, Terry. I'd love to hear a little bit more. Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger appointed you Secretary of the California Environmental Protection Agency, and later on you were Chief Policy Advisor of the governor. And I think you certainly were behind many of the really, for me actually breathtaking, because I live in California now, so I thank you for all the things you've done actually in getting this country to where it is now. But I'd love to hear a little bit more how you have been working behind the scenes in order to ensure that there's the right enabling environment, also for the businesses to come on board, and the corporate sector to really bloom and continue to innovate in this area. So over to you, Terry.
Thank you. I think the role of government in this case is to accelerate transitions that are going to happen anyway, because especially now as we're running out of time to solve climate change, it isn't that many of these things wouldn't happen anyway, it's just that they won't happen fast enough to reduce greenhouse gases and that concentration to avoid the 2 degrees centigrade target or even go below it, especially when we have misguided leaders like ours in the United States that don't understand that this is a business opportunity. So for example, in California, when we launched our Million Solar Roof initiative, we set up incentives for people to put solar on their rooftops where 50% of the cost of the solar installation was paid for by the government. And then if they waited a year, they would only get 40%. If they waited another year, they would only get 30%, et cetera. But the point is, by front-loading the incentives, it stimulated the business of the roofers, the electricians, the solar, the panel manufacturers, et cetera, and such that mass production brought the cost down, so that year by year, we got to the point where we don't need the subsidy, and the cost is now 50% or less below what it was back 10 years ago when we started that program. So a little bit of an enlightened incentive accelerates what obviously is a transition that would have happened anyway. And I think that's really one of the keys here, is that when we're looking at government policies, as you were talking about the NDCs, I think that's the biggest business plan and business opportunity sitting in plain sight that has ever existed on planet Earth, because 195 countries are filling out those, not only their intended goals, but how they're going to achieve them. So imagine you're a company selling wind turbines, and you want to know where the market for wind turbines might be. Well, you're going to be able to look at 195 countries' declarations and say, well, how much does this country expect to get from wind? How much this country, this country? You now know where to send your salespeople. You have a welcoming government that might provide some kind of incentive or even just fast-tracking projects, but now you know exactly where to go, to whatever your technology might be. And the governments then can play that role to just be the yeast that makes the bread rise, so to speak, and accelerates that transition before it's too late.
Thanks so much. Clearly, extremely important role of the government, and also understanding the business sector and really knowing what's the next move and what's the next innovation. And I think it brings me nicely to Christian. You know, what's the role of the banking sector? You are bringing, you're bringing, you know, a vast experience in the banking sector, and you obviously know we need the money to, you know, enable some of the innovation. So what is it that the banking sector can do, and what's also the role of regulations in that context?
So good afternoon from my side, and it's a big honor to join this panel here. Yeah, what can we do as a bank in banking side from the perspective of strong retail-focused bank like Erste Bank is? I see 2 points. One point is kind of divestment and lending principles. So more active divestment concerning saying no for financing which hinders us in the process of reducing the CO2 emissions. And we have to ask ourselves as a bank, what we do is the third question. Is not just one, how profitable it is, or two, that it's legal. It is also important to ask, is it the right thing to do? And I think this gives us the chance and the impact to shift from the business to transfer it to the climate action. Second, I think we have to bridge the retail client customers' expectation with sustainable investments. What we structure and offer as a bank with a big product range of sustainable investment products, and gives the client the opportunity and the chance to invest in company where they have the strong focus on sustainability. And if we do this filter and this approach as a service and as a commitment and full commitment to the product, we can offer it to our clients. And concerning your questions of the regulator, would say it's also the same question what I mentioned before, it's the right thing to do. I personally believe that no regulatory incentive can and will change it. It must be in the DNA of a bank itself to think about where they stand for, what they believe in, and how they like to go forward, and which role they want to play in the society. Banks need the reduction of capital requirements by if they want to invest in climate change projects or invest in sustainable energy production, it would help if the capital requirements for bank can be reduced, and the regulator can support this approach. And currently there are some trends in the EU Commission. They decide concerning defining a kind of definition how green finance or green assets can be done, and this will help in future and support in future the approach also of banks.
Thanks so much, and again I think, you know, the regulator as an accelerator basically can also in your case help there. So with that, let me ask let me ask you, Mr. Scheuerle, to really give you a little bit more insights on the role of the impact investors. I mean, we've heard about impact investors already today, and we know that they're still kind of at the margins of climate action, but at the same time, we've heard also that, you know, it's a really important, you know, to get them inside the overall game here. So what is it that you see can be done? What's the right incentives to really reach out to impact investors and get them and mainstream them into this area?
Thank you very much, and thanks very much everyone for joining today. I think it's a very important conference and discussion that we are having here today. typically when we talk about investments, there are basically two sides of it. There is, one side is the investment side. So first of all, you need investments that you can do. On the other side, there is the funding. On the investment side, I just would like to mention and congratulate R20 and the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation with their 100 Climate Solutions Projects campaign, which has identified not 100 projects, but as it was mentioned before, more than 600 projects through that campaign, which can be invested in if there is funding available and if there is the right structure. So there is one side of the equation that has been worked on tremendously so far. Then on the side of the funding, there is certainly the impact investor, which is typically referred to as a private investor, but it's not only the private investor. And since we are talking about actions today, and there are not only people like us here talking, but there are actually teams working on actions right as we speak here, and that's a team of R20, that's the teams of the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation, and that's a team of Blue Orchard as well. And what we are doing right now is we are bringing together governments, development finance institutions, private investors to raise capital for what we call the Subnational Climate Fund. This is a facility which is investing in projects at the subnational level, as the name of the fund says. It's what we're aiming at is basically replicating the California model. We want to bring the California success in taking climate actions to emerging markets. To that extent, we invest in renewable energy projects, we invest in energy efficiency projects, but we also invest in waste optimization projects, which is also a substantial and important part, which is very often neglected. We all do that in developing countries and working closely with cities, with regions, with states, because that's also what we believe as investment managers. We have to work with those authorities where the action happens in the end and the implementation takes place.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to ask you about a concrete example of where you are investing actually in the next round of questions, so be ready for that. But let me ask Renat. Renat, you bring a long experience also as a social entrepreneur and in the carbon markets, in the early day of the carbon markets. And there certainly you have seen a lot, how important regulation is and how detrimental it can also be. Can you share some of the lessons of that and what are other incentives?
Yes, sure, and good afternoon also from my side. Great honor to be here. So our company, Salzburg Group, indeed is a climate finance company. We have co-financed more than 600 projects in emerging markets. And, in such kind of panels and other situations, you often hear that industry has to do more, investors have to do more, we need partnerships and so on. In my experience, investing is actually, at least in theory, quite simple. Investors care about exactly three things: returns, scale, and risk. That's it. And if you want to understand how governments could accelerate, as Terry said and others said, accelerate this process, again, some things happen automatically. Many of the investments in renewables, for instance, they don't need any more acceleration in certain places, because they're viable without, they're just like a viable standalone. But government assistance should and will typically move along these three categories. It either increases returns, increases scale, or reduces risks. Just a few examples. A feed-in tariff, that increases return. A carbon credit or a renewable energy credit, that's also return. Same as result-based finance, a concept we may discuss later here. On the scale side, what governments can and should do: legal environment. Many projects fail because of lack of legal environment. Permitting, for instance, streamlined procedures for permits for solar rooftops, these kind of things. Also, global carbon pricing would help to scale certain interventions. And then last but not least, risk. And I find this one of the most interesting categories, because arguably it's the biggest bang for the buck, or the least taxpayers' money per unit of impact if you de-risk investments. To be mentioned here, blended finance or first loss tranches. So government take a first loss tranche in a fund. Then, very important, political risk insurances. So, you know, if the government stops paying your feed-in tariff, there's an insurance stepping in. Or one element we pioneered at my company, loan guarantees. Just one example here, in Switzerland we have a technology fund, and what the fund does, it's sponsored by the Swiss government. What the fund does, you're a clean tech company and you need growth capital, right? The bank doesn't give you a loan. So you can apply for a guarantee with the technology fund. Up to 60% is guaranteed by the Swiss government. That brings down finance cost, and if we do our job right, we don't need one taxpayer's dollars just to bring down finance cost. So you see how it works. Very little taxpayers' money invested, a lot of companies financed. We have about 55, I believe now. So far, not one single default. So without spending $1, we have brought down the capital cost of 55 companies, clean tech companies. So I think that's just yeah, I hope we have time to go into details in more of these approaches, which all accelerate investments in clean technologies and ultimately the financing of 2 degrees economy.
Great. Thanks so much, Renat. And I also hope we'll have a chance for a second round to hear a little bit more also, because your Swiss example, as always, Switzerland just sounds too good to be true. So I'd love to understand a little bit more how you do that and what's behind it and why has it not been done in other countries. But before we go there, let me ask Martin a little bit, you know, we've heard a lot about what are incentives, what's the role of the regulator, what's the role of different actors within the scheme, but you at REAP have a very special focus on monitoring and evaluation, which is, I think, another kind of element of really ensuring that, you know, we scale up action, because in the end, if you don't understand, you know, if you just invest but you don't know what's the outcome, so that one is difficult. So explain us a little bit more why that is an important factor.
Thanks, Barbara. So we actually focus on accelerating markets for clean energy and energy access in developing countries, in middle income and lower income countries, mainly in Africa and Southeast Asia, South Asia. And the reason why we got so much into monitoring and evaluation and learning is that we realized as project grant funders and as project developers, we realized we have to do that anyway, but we actually only do it halfway. Normally, not just here in my organization, but in any organization I've ever seen, governmental or private, you see that monitoring and evaluation ends up with a final report on the project, which ends up on some hard drive and maybe somewhere in a cloud and is not read very much. There are exceptions, but a lot of this material is not really being used. And it's partly the reason because it's called monitoring and evaluating and learning, and that sounds really academic and to many people a little bit boring. When you actually realize that once you do your monitoring correctly, you generate commercial intelligence, you generate investment intelligence, and you generate policy intelligence, then you suddenly change the tone of this whole thing, and the interest goes up very much. And so we are very much focusing now on finding the best methods to do this in order to generate business and policy intelligence that can be fed back into the investment community and can be fed back into the community of policymakers who need that kind of intelligence in a market-based, in a sector-based, aggregated form in order to be able to react to that on the legislative side. So that's a really, really basic thing. And I was thinking about this, you know, from talk to action, or however Arnie put it. I think that is a key to be used to turn the machinery on. If we generate that type of market intelligence, especially in the markets that are not working commercially, then we widen the shape where commercial money can actually eventually come in. Our focus is, of course, not at all the commercial space. We are focusing on frontier markets, what we call frontier markets. So these are markets that don't really work commercially yet. These are the markets of the, 65% of people in Western Africa who haven't got access to electricity yet. So they are not recognized as markets, but they can become markets. We heard it from Philips before, we heard it from others. They can become markets, and they need to become markets in order to have a sustainable commercial operation. a sustainable commercial provision of these markets with services. So it's not a one-off giving away solar lamps. It's actually a proper supply of these customers in these markets with the services that they need. That's what we need to achieve. And that does not work without the proper market intelligence. Therefore, instead of calling monitoring, evaluation, and learning a transaction cost in all these projects, and I get this transaction cost, I get beaten with this every time I mention that, and I beat back with the words that I say it's not transaction cost. That is where the transformation gain sits. That's exactly the point where the gain sits. And we need to focus that. We need to invest some money in that. It's not for free. And we need to get this going. Otherwise, impact investors don't know what they're doing. Broader investors don't know what they're doing. Development banks don't know well enough what the development is that they're achieving. So that's my first ball today, Barbara.
Great. Thanks so much, Martin. I think you nicely already, kind of help us go to the second round, because you already start, what we need to do is to think outside of the box, also in the context of monitoring and evaluation. I think that certainly is something which we need to understand, how we can work together and make, create the right enabling environment for the next stage. But let me just briefly kind of lead to the second round, where I think what we've heard here is that there's lots of ways that regulators and other actors can help set the right enabling environment for good action and for some new kind of funds and new mechanisms. But if you really want to fill the investment gap that we have and get us on a pathway that allows us to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, that we really need to scale up action. And in order to scale up action, what we have now is not working. We really need to think how we can continue to innovate, or how can we refine existing mechanisms. How can we really come up with mechanisms that are actionable and innovative and address some of the risks that different actors in the private sector still have. And I'm just giving one example before I'm asking every one of you for one quick example. But we at CPI are managing the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, which brings together public and private actors to really address some of the persisting barriers in the market, and does so by identifying, by developing stress testing and supporting the piloting of concrete climate finance instruments, which with the overall goal of really increasing private investment in emerging economies and getting private investment at scale with a little bit of seed money from the public sector. And we have in less than 3 years actually helped fundraise more than $600 million. We have a number of pilot projects in energy efficiency, in renewable energy, and adaptation even across the world. And we've also received some endorsement from the G7. But I think just to share one of the lab instruments examples, and I hope that we'll hear some of those then afterwards. We have one instrument which is actually an insurance mechanism which guarantees the savings from energy efficiency investments. It's called Energy Savings Insurance. It's currently being scaled by the Inter-American Development Bank to 7 countries, and is therefore reaching thousands of businesses in Latin America. So I think we need to come up with ideas like that that really can be replicated and scaled up in order to fill the gap. So Martin, back to you. Let's start on this side now. Thinking out of the box, I know that you have a project in Cambodia where you're working closely and which you have originated at REAP. So tell us a little bit more about that one.
Thank you, Barbara. I think one thing is very important when we look at climate action and mainstreaming climate action. The largest part of the economy, however you measure it, is actually small and medium enterprises and micro enterprises especially. And at the same time, the biggest work to be done in order to create prosperity and alleviate poverty and create climate resilience is also at that level. So a lot of investment needs to reach into those frontier markets that I described before. And we need financial instruments that inject public money very specifically into these markets to help them become, mature from frontier markets to more mature markets. So one of these financial instruments that we have created with Austrian money, by the way, Austrian money started it off, is at the moment still small, almost experimental fund in Cambodia, which is a revolving loan fund focusing on the agri-food value chain. So mainly on agricultural companies, horticultural companies in Cambodia. Cambodia is a country that's gone through a horrible civil war, you know, more than 20 years ago. It's still only climbing out of that trap slowly. It's still a net importer of vegetables, although it would have all the potential to supply itself. And one of the problems in some parts of the country is irrigation. Solar irrigation is an obvious answer, but how do you get solar irrigation to these relatively small producers?
Great. I do have to cut you short because we are running out of time.
Sorry.
Unfortunately, so, but
what we structured is a fund that is able to provide unsecuritized loans to these farmers, down to a level at the moment of about $8,000. That is not for free, because you have a lot of due diligence to do. You cannot give an unsecuritized loan without knowing exactly who you give it to. So there is an investment to be made. So this is not a commercial enterprise, such a fund. It's a financial injection device that helps to get this market going for Cambodia. We're building that out now. We're monitoring that very carefully, believe me. We're monitoring because we want to see what the mechanisms are, where we have success, where we have failure, with our partner Nexus in Phnom Penh, who are excellent. And we want to create a model for Cambodia, maybe for the region, that one can take further. So with the data that we can derive from that project, we can see how we can derive those financial instruments further.
Great, thanks so much, Martin. And Renato, I think you raised another very good point, which is like we gotta, you know, I think failure stories are extremely important. We should not only talk about the success stories. So, Renato, do you know about any, you know, either in the context of the funds that you're currently having, but, you know, what are some of the failure stories also that has helped basically to get you to the funds that you're now running?
Can we extend for 1 hour, maybe? No, obviously there's a huge amount of failure stories, and I think we should talk about them more often and also be more honest. One that comes to mind is, we're active a lot in Southeast Asia, and we have this Paris Agreement that comes with NDCs, which are of course fantastic, and the momentum is there. But what we observed on the ground is that Indonesia has just cut its feed-in tariff because the Minister of Environment changed. Thailand has just cut its feed-in tariff. That was a big hype in 2013. Now it's gone. And the Philippines just defaulted on payments on feed-in tariff, which is of course a disaster for investors. So I think the message here is there are failures, and I think it's important that we are also open about them, because otherwise we're discussing forever and we wonder why money is not flowing. But I think, and I honestly believe, that the movement we have seen now with Paris, with the financial industry now taking this more serious, that if we address these points and we structure the right product, such as I mentioned insurances and so on, and we basically develop capacity also at those government level and actually show the story that this is a business case to basically embrace renewables, for instance, that then we can learn from these mistakes and actually make Paris a success. But I think we need to be a bit more honest that not everything is rosy.
Absolutely, thanks so much. I completely agree, and thank you for these remarks here. And you know, I think, Patrick, you know, just going a little bit deeper, you know, what it is working in this, you know, the climate subnational fund that you talked about. You know, how is that working, and you know, how is it? I think one other point that you mentioned is extremely important. We haven't talked about that. Is the capacity building. I think at all levels, at government, at private sector, at local sector. So, how is your fund working, and what makes it different?
So. A few years ago, I was traveling to Cambodia, and we have lots of investments there in the microfinance space. And I was visiting one micro entrepreneur. Her name is Sarum Toom. She's a rice farmer, and in developing countries or frontier markets, emerging markets, most of the farmers are women. And I think that's also an interesting fact that we need to be aware of. Sarum Toom just lost her entire harvest due to a drought. And so we visited her, and I asked her, you know, what are you going to do now? And she, I really don't know, and I really have an issue. And then I was looking at her 3 children, which were also there, and I asked her, shouldn't the children be at school? And she said, yeah, basically yes, and 2 months ago they were also at school. But now I can't afford anymore to send them to school. And that was a key moment for me when I realized how important insurance is for poor and vulnerable households. And so when I came back to Switzerland, I was looking up our network with the development banks, and I saw that basically KfW, the German development bank, is working on a climate insurance fund as part of the Inju Resilience Initiative, which is a G7 initiative. And that was the starting point of a great partnership that we entered together with KfW. It's called the Climate Insurance Fund, another fund investing in developing markets. And what we've learned through that fund is how important the value chain is in these markets. So it's not only about having insurance available, you also need to make it somehow accessible for poor and vulnerable households. And this is something we learned that we are now also implementing with the subnational climate fund, and that's also something that Christoph Nuttall mentioned before. One of the great added value that they created is basically a context, a partnership, a network of different actors, and bringing them together facilitate the execution and implementation, which is absolutely crucial in these markets.
Great, thank you so much, really valuable, and I think it brings also the focus a little bit to the small scale, and for me it's really important to, think a little bit more how can we make funding accessible for both small scale projects, but also like households, smallholders. There've been a lot of focus on large infrastructure projects, and I'd love to hear your opinion a little bit of your experience, if there's a specific tools or the right market infrastructure in place to also, allow funding to flow more to small-scale projects, to households, to smallholders.
Yes, there are a lot of opportunities and possibilities to invest as a retail client also in smaller investments. And we as a commercial bank with a focus on retail banking as well, we offer our client a special dedicated product range for sustainability investments. And out of this range, with a big range, and we have client investments close to 4.5 billion euro, we have 3 funds out of that with having monitoring and impact. So we have a global impact fund with green bonds where we focus on that. We have a microfinance fund where we support and can invest as a retail client to microfinance, as well as invested in your microfinance fund. And we have third, we have with our big cooperation partner WWF, we have a fund called as Erste WWF Stock Environment Fund, which focus on 3 themes: water, energy and waste. And with the setup, it's a win-win situation. The clients, the retail client, can invest such products with a small amount, have a strong impact on that. We monitor it on a monthly basis with a footprint additional to the classical reporting. And the client do have as well a very good performance within the last 5 years with 12% on an annual basis. And additionally, what we do as an Erste Asset Management, we donated within the last 10 years close to 1 million euro together with our partner WWF, water protection and climate protection, to invest in rainforest and deregulation on rivers. And this is the direct impact what we can do together with a proportional investment of the retail client.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. I think that's some really good stories. And I'd like to ask you a little bit more, Thierry, now in your new role at the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundations. There's currently, particularly now, there's a big call for foundations to be more active in climate investments. What do you think are the tools or the ways to get philanthropic foundations more involved in that area?
Well, 2 things. One, foundations have enormous endowments, and most of those are invested in stocks and bonds, things that don't necessarily support the mission. And everyone talks about doing impact investing, but not many are doing it. And I think what we're hearing today is really the roadmap for foundations to put their money where their mouth is. The other thing is for them to support projects like what you're seeing from the R20 and other NGOs. I think smart investors should follow the NGOs. I mean, the project that I worked on for R20 for 2 years in Brazil was to help cities replace their inefficient streetlights with LEDs that save 65% of the energy, obviously reduce that amount of greenhouse gases from the energy production, and can pay it back from the savings. And you'd say, well, if it's that good, why wouldn't the cities just do it? because there was no manufacturing in country of these lights, and there was a very big import duty, because they didn't trust the lights that were being manufactured and sold around the world, because there were some horror stories of things that didn't work, and because the cities didn't have the financing to just replace a lot of lights at once and take the time to pay it back from the savings. So while there was a will, there wasn't a way. But by supporting R20, having foundations support the R20 to be able to send technicians down there to teach the asset managers, the streetlight owners and managers in cities, to bring manufacturers there to set up manufacturing in country so that the lights would be affordable, and then to create a special purpose finance vehicle so that the cities could borrow the money, pay it back from the savings, and by the way, it was guaranteed by each city's local utility tax, so it was a very good deal for the investors. But it took a nonprofit or some other intermediary to go down there and put those pieces together once again to accelerate what would have happened sooner or later anyway, but for all the obvious benefits. So if the investors had simply, and many of them did, follow the R20 into projects like that, they can see something that meets the criteria we heard about, that deals with risk and reward and opportunity.
Great. Thanks so much, Jerry. Again, you know, philanthropic foundations can be accelerators to real action, I guess, here. But I do think that there needs to be, you know, change of mind and how risky you are, how you're willing to really accept some more riskier investments, which is, I think, is going on at the moment. So I look forward to hearing more. And if you need a non-profit to help you put things together, I'm here. So don't worry to reach out. But last but not least, before I come to our special intervention, I'd love to hear your thoughts on really what are some of the special ways do you attract renewable energy and energy efficiency funding and get to some concrete projects in West Africa.
Yes, thank you very much. As I said, sure, for us, we believe that policy initiatives can always make a big difference. And I'm saying this from a practical example in our case. We are still in the region that we have several countries that still give fossil fuel subsidies. And you will see that for those countries that still have high fossil fuel subsidies, the renewable energies are not growing because the market is distorted. It makes fossil fuel investments look more attractive because of the subsidy. You go to a country like Ghana, for instance, where they have eliminated all subsidies whatsoever on fossil fuels, the market is growing faster there. You go to Nigeria, on the other hand, the market is very sluggish because of the fossil fuel subsidies. But they see it as what they call a political issue, and they just scared to touch it. But one day they'll just have to do it. They have no choice. And it's already biting them now, and it's just a matter of time, but they will do it. The next is carbon tax, which we try to encourage some of the countries to even adopt. But sure, it's very difficult to get that if you cannot remove fossil fuel subsidies. That's difficult to get that. But we managed to encourage them to get into auctions instead of feed-in tariffs. And actually, all the countries that adopted feed-in tariffs, all those feed-in tariffs collapsed. They practically all collapsed. And now what we do is work with them to do auctions for projects. And we have seen 5 projects already successfully auctioned and at very good prices, at prices far lower than the feed-in tariffs adopted earlier, which shows that, and these projects are being implemented, which shows that really the auction method is good. Now coming to green bonds. Interestingly, we have Nigeria that has taken the lead to launch green bonds. So that's very encouraging, sure, just for $20 million. But that is a lot. Actually, Nigeria estimates that they need $146 billion to implement their NDC. So 20 billion is just a drop in the ocean, but it's a good start. Very soon you see others replicating it, and that is quite encouraging. So practically, policy initiatives actually can make a very big difference, make the market more attractive, and get actual investor interest into these markets. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think lots of really interesting initiatives coming out from there that really can, particularly if you replicate them around Africa, can make a big difference. So with that, I'd love to invite our special intervention from Andrea Hagmann, who is the member of the Executive Board of the Development Bank of Austria, to join us here and give us a brief I'd love to get your perspective, really. What is the role of development finance institutions in this context? We, are very different actors on this table here, so it's very welcome to have your perspective.
Yeah, thank you very much also for having me on this panel with this intervention. When you look at the amount of financing that is needed for fighting climate change and also for achieving the goal, sustainable energy for all, this is a huge amount, and I think it was already mentioned on the table, we are not talking about billions anymore, we are talking about trillions. So this is really a lot of money, and this sometimes makes me feel a little bit afraid. And when you talk, or when you ask the question, and what do you expect then from banks or from development, from finance institutions, the first answer is always, well, they should provide the money. But a closer look reveals that it is not all about money, and I think we have heard this here from the panel very well. It is about a lot of different things, and that's where also development finance institutions can come in. I'm representing today the Development Bank of Austria. We are a member of 15 European development finance institutions with the mandate to promote the private sector in developing countries and in emerging markets. So we strongly believe that the private sector can really help and give a big contribution to alleviating poverty, but also to help to combat climate change. So what can we really do, or where do we come in? We have heard about preparation of projects that is very important, and that is also one of our tools that we can offer here. Development finance institutions see that there are a lot of project ideas around. They are sometimes a little bit immature. They need some structuring to make them, as we have heard, bankable or investable, so that private banks and private companies can come in. What can we do in this respect? We can offer capacity building measures, we can offer financing, we can offer our expertise in structuring, and we can help also project developing companies to get set up and to do their business on the ground. Then, if you have these bankable projects, you need financing, but often these projects are in very risky countries, or they are very complex. So it needs more than just bringing in banks. It needs a very good structuring. We have also heard about first loss tranches already. So it's the first loss tranches that the governments can bring in, but it's also the development finance institution that can come in the next risky tranche, the mezzanine financing, and work as a catalyst then for commercial banks or for pension funds or for other private investors to come in. So it's really, and that's what also the development finance institutions have done in the past, to join forces, to bring in good ideas, to combine our strength and bring in different kind of financing sources. I think I have worked with a lot of panelists, or at least had talks with them that are already on the panel. We have looked at projects from ECRE. We have talked with REAP. We are working with Blue Orchard. We have also worked with Erste Bank, so there are not a lot of left, and I'm going also to talk to them later on. DFIs can be also, or see themselves as a bridge to other partners. And I completely agree with what has been said on the panel before. It needs the partnership. It needs to join our strength to really get to this sustainable energy and the sustainable world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And just to add, actually, also Dr. Assi have helped us understand investment trends. And just to make a point here, development finance institutions at the moment provide 30% of all the global climate finance flows. I think that is a big part of what is going on, so I think extremely important role. But we have unfortunately come to the end of our panel. I'd love to go on for a few more hours, but not now. We have been a little late, but let me just use a few seconds just to give you the main points from what I've heard in this discussion here. I think that what we've heard is that to close the investment gap, we really need to try to balance the risk and returns and really to attract some of the investors that are currently still at the margins of climate action. And there's a few key elements behind that. One is obviously public resources, but also policy, which is kind of the backbone, but also the accelerator. I think the other collaboration, really bringing the ecosystem of financial and non-financial actors together to really make things happen. I think the final one is then really use innovation to walk the dog, to walk from talk to action and really make this happen. And I'm an optimist, and I thank you all very much for helping me understand that we have a good future ahead of us. We have to do more work, but I think we're on a good pathway here. Thank you very much.